before we get started, I want to say that, Patrick and I, one of our presenters tonight, we've talked about this in passing over on the Montpelier site about how cool would it be for us to kind of sit down and just talk Constitution. And, it felt like because of Black History Month and then, of course, this being coming up on President's Day weekend, this would be an ideal topic for us to actually try to delve into. Okay, and some of the goals of this session will be for us to think about specifically the cornerstone of the U.S. democracy, the Constitution. What does that mean in terms of the African American experience? Okay, and so with that, I do want to introduce my esteemed guest from the Montpelier Foundation. We have Dr. Katie Crawford-Lackey and Mr. Patrick Campbell. And, first kind of kicking off, my name is George Monroe Jr., and I am the executive director for the Montpelier Descendants Committee. And so I've been here in this capacity now for the last, we'll say 7 months, and very happy to be here, in terms of being able to share space with you all. But enough about me. I would definitely want to get to our guest. So Dr. Katie Crawford-Lackey is the director of the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution at James Madison's Montpelier. She is a public historian, scholar known for her research on LGBTQ+ history, cultural heritage, and inclusive storytelling. She also serves as the host of the Consider the Constitution podcast, and she's engaging with experts on constitutional issues affecting Americans. And so she earned her PhD in public history from Middle Tennessee State University. And we just got finished talking about an area that I'm very fond of that I didn't even know that Middle Tennessee was there. So, welcome, Dr. Crawford-Lackey. And then, of course, my main man, Mr. Patrick Campbell. He's a fellow Marine veteran, just like I am. And he's the assistant director of the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution at James Madison's Montpelier. He's a Marine Corps infantry officer, having served 21 years. And he's also spent 13 years teaching AP comparative and U.S. government courses, coaching, and administration in independent schools. Okay, he joined Montpelier in 2017 and is thankful for the chance to partner with groups who want to expand their understanding and engagement as citizens. So welcome to the both of you. And so first off, I want to say thanks and very happy to get this conversation started. I know it's been in the works for the last couple of months, but we're here. So we're going to kick off with an historical kind of overview of the Constitution. So we know that, James Madison himself was a key architect of the Constitution, having written it on the grounds for what we think, right? And we know that the Constitution was ratified in 1788. So when we think about, for example, the Constitution as it relates to the enslaved, Africans and African Americans even, can you all start to talk off or kick off this conversation with, kind of an historical kind of overview, and then let's get into things like, values and ideals in the terms of the African American experience?
I'll take a first shot at it. I think Dr. Katie's going to hit especially the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. George, thanks so much for inviting us, and Pandora for hosting this. At the Center for the Constitution, I'm here at the grounds. If it wasn't getting dark, you could see part of the grounds here at Montpelier behind me. Katie and I have this great job to engage people with the Constitution. And the more they engage in our mind, kind of the better. And I want to start off with a couple quotes from some of the Mandela Washington Fellows who were here that last summer. And it's also going to be in a podcast that I'm going to drop in the links. Nafisa from Nigeria says, democracy is more of a marathon than a sprint. And Yara Dahab said, I have learned that democracy is not very straightforward. She's from Sudan, living in South Africa, because she's a refugee from Sudan. And they were both here on the grounds last year. And so we talk about the beginnings with James Madison in that old library upstairs in Madison's home, which most of you have been in, and him thinking about these ideals of government. And I think it's the ideals, the values that so many Americans can agree on. Wow. They are revolutionary. And, you know, the more time we get to spend here, the more revolutionary we see in terms of world history. And the human practice of those ideals falls incredibly short. So that Constitution that Madison's called the father of, not that he wrote it, but he had so much impact on the ideas and getting it done, has, quick overview, at least 4 instances where the word slave is not used, but they're talking about African Americans who are being identified by their skin color as enslaved people. So everybody on the call is going to say 3/5 compromise. Article 1, we see a couple places where we're talking about the legislature, and 3/5 of all other persons are going to be counted for representation in the House of Representatives. Huge impact on the House of Representatives, and also many of you know, big impact on the Electoral College, because those states with enslaved population are going to get more Electoral College votes. Hence, we have what we call sometimes the Virginia dynasty. 4 out of our first 5 presidents from Virginia, partly because of that 3/5 article. Article 1 also says the migration or importation of such persons as any states now existing shall think proper to admit of such persons, the migration or importation. So the Fugitive Slave Clause cannot end before 1808. It's going to have a 20-year existence. And they even think so far as, what about taxing importation? There's going to be a $10 limit on that. Third one we should hit is, let's move to Article 4. Article 4 of the 7 articles is really about the relationship between the states. So we're going to see the Fugitive Slave Clause in there, that if somebody escapes from a state and they were, the language is no person held to service or labor in one state, right? So third euphemism of, we're not going to say slavery in the Constitution. And then finally, the textbooks 20 years ago would not have mentioned this, I don't think, about slavery. The U.S. shall protect the states against invasion and domestic violence. And you go to the U.S. government textbooks and they talk about Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts and veterans of the Revolutionary War rising up against the state of Massachusetts and the government there right before, months before, 6 months before the Constitutional Convention. It's going to have an impact. It's going to show up in the Constitution that a bunch of veterans have started to close down the courts, right? They've started to use violence and almost invaded Massachusetts. But of course, for many of the people in the convention, roughly 25 enslavers are in that room in Philadelphia. Domestic violence means an enslaved revolt, right? One of the scariest things that could happen to them. But you know, as a kid going to elementary school in the 70s and going to high school and college in the 80s, I wasn't taught about that piece. So, George, good enough for a quick overview on that. I want to move to the Bill of Rights at some point, but keep me honest here.
Absolutely. So like one of the things that you and I had talked about before in terms of, you know, definitions and key terms used in the Constitution. So when we see things like demos or republic, right? So when you think about, you know, kind of the historical treatment of African Americans to include enslavement, you know, what was the purpose of those terms, and did it include the enslaved? When we think about the uses of the terms that the founding fathers used in crafting the Constitution.
Generally, no. But this is a great point to point out. When we say the founding fathers believe, the framers thought, well, they thought a lot of different things. And Madison's one of these folks who's clearly behind the continuation of enslavement. He wants to see it in. He talks about the evils of enslavement his entire life and really never does anything to get rid of it, in a way. That's a glossy enough way to say it. Gouverneur Morris from New York, who is considered the penman of the Constitution, who puts the words, who writes the preamble, right? Establish justice, provide for the common defense, secure the blessings of liberty, ensure domestic tranquility. This guy who puts that, the we the people. Gouverneur Morris from New York is the guy who gets the phrase we the people in there, because it really had been we the states before that. He calls slavery the curse of heaven. And it shows up in James Madison's notes. And Gouverneur Morris is looking at those other delegates and saying the curse of heaven, and describing, wait a minute, if an inhabitant of South Carolina or Georgia goes to the coast of Africa and grabs a person and brings them back against, all thoughts of humanity, applies this bondage system to them, they're going to get represented more than the people in New York. So you definitely see the debate at the Constitutional Convention. It's not that it wasn't thought of, it was extremely well thought of. And I'm going to be descriptive. There's a compromise that takes place at the convention to keep the Union together. That's not a rationalization. That's not a good reason. It's just descriptive. That's what has happened in 1787, is you get these clauses that enforce slavery, and it's going to take almost 100 years until the Civil War where it's addressed. And I would argue we return to some of these values, and yet we failed to carry them out in practice. Katie's going to get into that a little bit more. If you want, I'll get into the Bill of Rights a little bit.
So that it feels like that's a good segue into the Bill of Rights, right? And so, a lot of times when the general public comes up, one of the things that the interpreters will say, when doing the house tour, when doing a walk of the grounds, is that President Madison was one of the main key architects, key figures that crafted the Bill of Rights, right? And so what's always been interesting to me as an African American, and even also having a background in 19th century history, it's interesting to me because you kind of called it out already as far as that contradiction, right? We're talking about liberties and we're talking about freedoms, but yet you have whole families, whole communities even that exist in Montpelier, a stone throw from that old library, that are in bondage. And so how do you correlate, kind of the kind of thinking of the founding fathers, and then of course looking at this quote unquote the contradiction in the form of African chattel slavery, and how it relates to then this kind of subsequent documents such as the Bill of Rights in the framing of this country.
I want to jump ahead to 1961 and then go back to a few miles from here, Blue Run Baptist Church.
Okay.
1961, the police show up at Dolly Mapp's house in Ohio. And she says, "You ain't coming in without a warrant." So they leave, and the Ohio police get a piece of paper and they say, "Here's your warrant." Guess what? It's not a warrant. They thought they could push over this African-American woman in the search. They were actually looking kind of for a bomb suspect, not what they found. Dolly Mapp takes her case to court that they didn't have a warrant, and we get a new rule on the Fourth Amendment on the right of to be protected against unreasonable search and seizures. We get an exclusionary rule that any evidence we get in violation of the Fourth Amendment is going to be excluded from trial. Pretty good incentive for police officers to not violate the Fourth Amendment, because whatever they get is going to be excluded from trial. We don't know that until an African-American woman in Ohio in 1961 really stands up and pushes her rights. but it's using the language that James Madison gave on the floor of the House of Representatives in New York City in June of 1789. 1789 to 1961. So we have these values that don't get put into practice. And so often the story is an African American standing up for their rights and getting our acknowledgement, our understanding, our practice of the Constitution closer to the value of the words. George, folks on the call, I would love to tell you that James Madison gives an amazing speech June 8, 1789 in New York City about the Bill of Rights because he's so concerned about minorities. That would be untrue. What he's concerned about is minority votes, because he's just had this great struggle to get the Constitution first written in Philadelphia and then ratified in Virginia when he's arguing against Patrick Henry. And now Patrick Henry makes sure that James Madison's not in the US Senate. Remember in that Constitution, right? The state legislatures are going to pick the senators. Madison comes in a very respectable third place. He does really well, but Patrick Henry makes sure that two anti-federalists are 1 and 2. So now James Madison is running for the House of Representatives. Patrick Henry's still doing his thing because James Madison's just beaten Patrick Henry in an argument to get Virginia to ratify. Patrick Henry draws the districts in the 5th District of Virginia, the first time we've had congressional districts in Virginia, to put Colonel James Monroe in the same district. Now James Madison, who's going to get called the father of the Constitution later, is running against a Revolutionary War vet, anti-federalist, 6'2" guy, about a foot taller, weighs maybe 70 pounds more than the 105, 110-pound Madison. Madison's a politician. Madison needs votes. And he writes to Reverend George Eve, who is the Reverend of Blue Run Baptist Church a few miles down the road here on Route 20. There might even be some members from Blue Run Baptist Church here. So Madison does not need a Bill of Rights. I would argue that the overriding theme in our Bill of Rights, and most Bill of Rights, is to protect minorities. Speech. It's about minority speech. It's not about majority speech. Religion. It's not about majority religions. It's about a religion that many others would disfavor, right? People who are in a criminal trial, 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment. It's about people who are not in the majority. So Madison writes to a Baptist preacher, right? He actually really has been concerned about free exercise of religion. What he would use the term conscience, would often mean religion. He's concerned about the rights of conscience. And he's writing to Reverend George Eve, January 2nd of 1789, the first time we ever see James Madison support a Bill of Rights. We have letters with Madison talking to Thomas Jefferson, talking to others. We don't need a Bill of Rights. It's already protected in the states, so we don't need a U.S., a federal Bill of Rights. And he's writing to a Baptist preacher, hey, talk to your friends, tell people that I'm going to support a Bill of Rights, right? Because Baptists, Lutherans, Methodists are minorities in this 5th district that had been an Anglican district post 1776. It's going to be essentially an Episcopalian district. And that's where we first see James Madison supporting the Bill of Rights. Fortunately, he delivers on his campaign promise and gets a Bill of Rights through the House, helps push through the Senate, but it's not because of his benevolent, I'm going to look out for others. It's a political move. I'm really glad he does it, but his motivations are not what they get to applied later, as we see often that marathon rather than a sprint, that marathon of slowly doing better and better in terms of the demos, of rule by the people, of the republic, the thing of the people, that we see that republic or democracy be more inclusive?
So that actually kind of brings me to, like, you know, pretty much the conversation around kind of some of the root causes for the Civil War, right? So, we have a number of agreements and compromises, so to speak. And I use this colloquialism as the kind of the proverbial can being kicked down the road, right? To the point where there's actual arms and where folks have to actually draw their lines. And so we start to think about, okay, these additional amendments, right? And so prior to that time where that first bullet is launched, can you speak to, some of the kind of arguments and discussions leading up to the presentment of the 15th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 13th Amendment, things of that nature? Not necessarily in order, of course, but, thinking about those kind of like drivers that resulted in the War of the States, and then, of course, the impact on African American experience.
Well, I think it's important to mention, kind of leading up to that question, as you both have referenced, the Constitution does not state the word slave or slavery in it. And while that's a silence, I would say it's not an absence, because the Constitution is very much about how is the federal government, going to be structured? What's the relationship going to be like between the federal government and the states? Which that disagreement between the states' rights to own enslaved people versus the federal government becomes a key cause of the Civil War. And so when we think about kind of the lead up, understanding the Constitution as in essence, a document that supports and legitimizes slavery even further is really important. And it's also implied, even though we don't see that word in the Constitution. The Constitution is about the economic structure of America, what that's going to look like under this new structure of government. And of course, by that point in history, America is growing increasingly reliant on enslaved labor. So if we're going to talk about the economy, we know that it's going to be talking about slavery, even if we're not stating those words in the Constitution. So as we lead up to the Civil War, there's a lot of tension happening between states. We think about, westward expansion as new states are entering the Union. Are those states going to be states that permit slavery? Are they going to be free states? Because we also know from looking at the Constitution that due to this three-fifths compromise that Patrick referenced, enslaved people and counting them as part of the population does in fact give Southern states political power. So as we bring states into the Union, where's that power, those votes in the Congress, where are those votes going to go based on population? We also have, social context happening. For example, we have Uncle Tom's Cabin that's published by Harriet Beecher Stowe that kind of sheds light on what enslavement looks like. A lot of Northerners may not be familiar with what's happening. We also have John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, where him and a group of men tried to seize the arsenal at this strategic point in West Virginia with the goal of freeing enslaved people. And that happens in 1854. So there's a lot of different things happening across the United States that is creating this uneasiness that eventually leads up to the Civil War. And I'll also note, the founding of the Republican Party, it becomes a party in the 1850s, and it's anti-slavery. It's more of the progressive party at that point in time. And the fear is that slavery is going to take away jobs from working white people. So again, kind of all these different things happening. And Patrick, you might have some thoughts on this as well.
I think that's great. And maybe we can go further into 13th, 14th, 15th if you want, Katie.
It's
Sure.
interesting, right, because like when I read the news, or I'm on social media or whatever have you, there's always this kind of like back and forth that you typically will see in terms of, the real reason the Civil War started. Like you hear the conversation, well, it was because of states' rights and our heritage, and it was basically the North trying to take over and trying to dictate the Southern way of life. So, you know, one of the things that I've researched is secession documents, right? And then to Dr. Crawford-Lackey's point, the key thing that you see in a lot of the Southern states secession documents is it's slavery being the primary driver for seceding from the Union. And so in that regard, right, so we kind of have the historical background as to what some of the primary reasons were. Well, yeah, there was the economic component, but we're not talking about in this particular instance. And Dr. Katie, you just kind of gave me something that I hadn't considered before in terms of the Constitution being the economic structure of America. And so you can kind of see how that kind of debate and that kind of disagreement between basically the geopolitics within the country drove to that ultimate tipping point, right? And so when we start to think about the 13th Amendment, now I'm going to pass it back to you. Like, how do you see that as kind of furthering or not furthering the cause in terms of the treatment of African Americans to include the enslaved?
So when the 13th Amendment is passed in 1865, ending the Civil War, it abolishes slavery, but there is this loophole, except for punishment of a crime. And that becomes, as we see later, especially post-Reconstruction, a way that the South essentially kind of reclaims this power over newly freed Black people in the South. And so after the 13th Amendment is ratified, I think sometimes when we study it in history, we think, oh, great, like slavery's over, moving on. But, we all know that progress isn't linear. And also, when you kind of think more deeply about what's going on at the time, the South is kind of, in shambles. It was, it had broken away from the Union. And now there's this question that the federal government is asking itself is how do we bring the South back into the Union? That was the goal of the war. How are we going to reunite? And so, are they going to punish Confederate soldiers, especially, leaders? What's that going to look like? And we have this huge population of newly freed people. They're not citizens yet because that comes with the 14th Amendment in 1868. They oftentimes states outlawed education for enslaved people. So, when we talk about education, even marriage, enslaved people could not legally marry each other. They formed bonds, created families, but under the law, that was not a legal binding marriage. So getting married, education, also reuniting with people that had, family members, friends that had been sold away. So this kind of reunification that happens. So there's so many different things that are occurring from, what's going to happen to Confederates, former Confederates. How do we bring this new group of people into the Union as well? So we do have this series of Reconstruction Amendments, what we call them. So the 13th, 14th, and then eventually the 15th Amendment in 1870, which recognizes Black men's right to vote. So we see this expansion of rights. But as Patrick was mentioning earlier, you can have laws on the books, but if they're not being enforced, it's not really a law in practice. So yes, people were free now, but due to this loophole in the 13th Amendment, we do see different methods for reclaiming Black labor. And we see that through Black codes. We see that through convict leasing. So, Black men and women would be arrested either on false charges or really low-level misdemeanor charges such as, loitering. But then they would be sent to prison for, years on end. And they would often be leased out to the state or to, private organizations to do really hard labor. So we almost see like this informal form of slavery happening. And then, the 15th Amendment is another good example. During Reconstruction, when the federal government is in the South, kind of monitoring Southern states, making sure that these new laws and amendments are being followed, Black people do run for political office. They hold these offices, and it is this kind of step forward. But then when Northern troops pull out of the South, we see kind of these folks who are former Confederate leaders kind of take over and retain their political offices. And so Black people are disenfranchised. They're, put in prison at higher numbers. And, these freedoms that were hard won kind of disintegrate.
George, can I jump in?
Absolutely. Yeah.
This is actually a commercial interruption. I dropped 4 podcast links in the chat. So Katie's hosted about 36 wonderful podcasts on all kinds of topics on the Constitution, from U.S. attorneys to speech to religion. But I highlighted 4 of them because one is our chairman of the board of directors, Dr. Hassan Kwame Jeffries, on Reconstruction. 2 by Deanza Cook that further explore these topics Katie's been talking about with the 13th Amendment and how these loopholes play out in policing and Reconstruction. And then one of them from the Young African Leader Institute Fellows. But if you're at all interested in these topics, we try to grab our scholars whenever they come to the center, and sometimes when they don't come to the center, to further explore these topics. Thanks, George, for letting me get that in.
Absolutely. One of the things that's been near and dear to my heart, when you think, for example, the 13th Amendment, and you fast forward to the 21st century, and that is the topic of mass incarceration. And that ultimately, it predominantly impacts Black and brown people, specifically Black and brown men. What are your thoughts? And this might be a stretch, and I know we hadn't talked about this, but I'm going to throw this out there. How do you think President Madison would view the whole concept of mass incarceration today, when these folks were actually thinking about the Constitution and how we think about, for example, this whole concept of liberty, now that we have crossed that kind of question of who constitutes an American citizen?
In a lot of ways, the right answer is we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great question, and folks try to get us on this issue at other times. I'm going to take it a little different direction, George.
Okay.
It's up to us to make these values come into practice. And we've been given this incredible opportunity in free speech, in state and federal relations, to be involved in our government, to push for an amendment, to take a case to court, to vote, to write elected officials. And we need to use those opportunities we have. And so many of the things I can look back on, often it's African Americans advancing these causes. And so in terms of, why are we talking about Black History Month? Why are we talking about African American history? I mean, I don't think I'm going to have to sell anything to people on this video of it's American history. And if we use the phrase standing on the shoulders of giants, so many times those giants, whether it's Dallery Mapp, whether it's somebody else putting that Constitution into practice and making some of the values get a little bit closer, still a human institution, but a little bit closer to more perfect union. Now, I will give Madison one little prop here. He's willing to talk about things that he doesn't get right. And he's willing to listen to people. He's sitting down in his 80s. If you've been in that, what we call Mr. Madison's room, where you've got that French bed, that lit up Polonaise bed right? It's one of the smaller rooms. There's no seats in there. And if you've looked at that China set, that original Madison Daguerreotype China, he is sitting there with Harriet Martineau from Great Britain. She's an abolitionist. And she goes back and talks about how, engaged Madison is in this conversation. Does he get it right? No. But I think he's following some of what, and I got to give a shout out to Rebecca Gilmore Coleman, because she's been such a wonderful influence on me since I met her in 2018. But she says in one of our videos, right? I think it's, I got to try to get the quote correctly here. I feel like it's our responsibility. Rebecca's looking at the camera. I feel like it's our responsibility, both black and white, to talk about what happened, because if we don't know where we came from, how are we going to go forward? How are we going to go forward? So, George, the question is well placed of what would Madison thought, but I think the better answer is, what are we going to do with the opportunity we've been given? And now Katie's going to help me get the answer better.
No, I think that's a good point, and I just want to build on that, because I think it comes down to the question of what is the purpose of imprisonment, and what's this purpose of justice? So what justice are we trying to serve? And if we look at Madison and kind of his political thoughts, he was always concerned about a very, very strong federal government, and if it had the power and authority to do certain things. Now, as Patrick mentioned, he was not in favor necessarily of a Bill of Rights. He didn't think we needed it to outline what our individual rights are. However, I do think he would have reservations about kind of the reach of the government and what good is served by kind of these prison sentences. And, during the colonial era up through, the 1800s even, there's this debate within kind of this prison movement about, should it be for punishment or reform? Like, what are we trying to do by putting somebody in prison? Are we trying to punish them, or are we trying to kind of reform them to bring them back into society? And how do we do that? And I think, as you, Patrick, are mentioning, what do we do today? And I think it's important to ask ourselves, what do we hope to accomplish by this? Is, the system we currently have, is it serving that purpose? And is it for the betterment of society, for all people? How is this helping society? And people might draw their different, opinions from that, but I think keeping those questions at the top of mind is really important when we're talking about this.
Awesome. Yeah, because I mean, I often look at things like you've already kind of, talked about, post-emancipation, after Reconstruction, there were black codes, then you run into Jim Crow, and then you get segregation. And then, of course, that leads into the civil rights movement. And now there's a number of other things that, African Americans, even up until the 1980s, have been impacted by, in terms of redlining even. And that's within my lifetime, right? And so it seems like there's always, as there's different progress that's made, there's still this kind of morphing that takes place in terms of disenfranchisement. And I respect what you say, Mr. Patrick, in terms of, it's up to us to really kind of call out, like, when we see these types of things taken on, like, are we voting? Are we coming together and to talk with our representation and things of that nature? So what that does for me, it also encourages and says that, the Constitution is still a living and breathing document, and it's not a once and done. And I think in terms of the African American community, I think one of the pushes, and I think one of the, if I may say, the NBC has a great opportunity to really kind of highlight that particular point, and that is the Constitution is still living and breathing, and we can actually influence it in a political way to get some of the things that we feel like society or the case of laws, whatever have you, fall short of. So I want to thank you both for this conversation. Of course, we can go on and on about it, but with about, I would say, 19 minutes left, I do want to give an opportunity for some of our attendees to ask questions. And so, if you do have a please feel free to put them in the chat, and then we will see how Dr. Katie and Mr. Patrick can address them. All right, so from our brother man Craig, good to see you, Craig. Did Elijah Craig have any influence as an ordained minister at Blue Run, and his arrest for preaching without a license have any influence on James Madison Jr. and religious freedom as captured by the Bill of Rights?
I don't know that name, Elijah Craig, but one of the best revolutionary areas of James Madison is religious freedom. And when he's in college, he's talking about getting out of the plantation business. And he doesn't. And one of the reasons the plantation business gives him the enslavement, the forced slaves, or gives him the ability to go to Princeton and to study and do all these political things, because there's not a lot of money in politics. Even as president, he wasn't making money. Honestly, he was spending the money he was making. But when he came back from Princeton, he sees what many listeners would know as the persecution of the Baptists, that's heavily in Culpeper and in this area, and exactly what Craig Galloway is saying, the preaching without a license. So if you're Anglican, you're the state religion, right? We're talking early 1770s. We're talking just before 1776. You don't need a license to preach. You're the state religion. You're Anglican. You're good, right? If not, you have to apply for a license. If you're Lutheran, if you're Methodist, if you're Baptist, right? And especially Baptists are being targeted, thrown in jail, ridiculed. It's ugly example of how humans can treat other humans and make an other. So in this case, the other's not completely based on skin color, it's based on religion. And Madison's seen Baptists being persecuted, and he we don't have great data on the subject, but he's kind of getting into this, I'm going to represent people. And then that's going to play out when Madison's 25 and he's in Williamsburg, because that's when he's going to get the free exercise statement in the Virginia Declaration of Rights. When George Mason writes the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Like he more than any Madison father of the Constitution, more than Madison architect of the Bill of Rights. George Mason writes the Virginia Declaration of Rights in June of 1776, before Thomas Jefferson is getting all the credit for the Declaration of Independence. But George Mason says government should have the fullest toleration of the exercise of religion. George Mason, who's the age of Madison's father, 25-year-old Madison, says that needs to be free exercise. So right after he's seen Baptists and others persecuted here in Central Virginia, he's down at the capital of the country of Virginia in June of 1776. Virginia's a country, right? It's about to be a breakaway colony, become a new country. And he's saying it needs to be free exercise. So thanks for Craig. I hope to see you in person here on site sometime, and you can tell me more about Elijah Craig. But what a great question.
It was great. Thanks for the explanation. It's the same Elijah Craig who's the father of Kentucky bourbon. He and his brother took their congregation west. So he's an interesting person, being a minister, but also the father of Kentucky bourbon, and he was from Orange County. So I found it interesting. But there are records of him interacting with both Madison and Jefferson. So I was just curious of what your thoughts were. That was an excellent response. Thank you.
All right. Dr. Katie, did you have anything else to add to the question?
No, that was really well put.
While folks are thinking of another question, Madison, there's 27 amendments to the Constitution. Madison really writes 11 of them, 1 through 10 and 27. But the 14th Amendment that we've just barely touched on contains the words "no state shall." Madison used the words "no state shall" June 8, 1789, when he proposed what became the Bill of Rights and also what became our 27th Amendment. Madison, who was arguing in Philadelphia at the age of 36, hey, we're not worried about this limited federal government. Don't worry about the limited federal government. The states already have Bill of Rights, Declaration of Rights. When he's arguing against Patrick Henry in Williamsburg at the age of, he's in Richmond now at the age of 37. Hey, don't worry about the federal government. Worry about the states. They're the ones who really have the power. And if we go back to late 1700s, 1800s, the states have the power, right? But Madison had used the words no state shall in 1789, and they show up in the 14th Amendment in 1868. And I think everybody in the call is going to look at me like, yeah, the federal government violates people's rights sometimes, but so often it's the state governments. And so this complex interplay of federalism, again, Madison misses on a lot of things, and especially enslavement. We could have a semester on how Madison misses it on enslavement, but he does get how the interaction of government, and George and I have had great conversations about, who's the other? What do people do? We create others so that we can have ours, and Madison really foresees that in government because he studied so much the operation of government. And so I want to give him props for the no state shall. I think we got a question here.
Yeah, so William Penn wrote a Charter of Liberties. How does this enter into the information at the Constitutional Convention?
I'll take a shot at it. Maybe Katie will clean it up. So about 55 men show up there, 39 sign, and there's a lot of different ideas. Madison gets called the father of the Constitution because when he's in his 70s in Philadelphia, there's a toast from Charles Ingersoll. And Charles Ingersoll says, if George Washington is entitled to be the father of our country, then James Madison is the father of that Constitution. But Madison says, many hands, many minds write it. So a William Penn, a James Wilson from Pennsylvania, a Gouverneur Morris, there's so many of these men who have an impact there, and those are all going to come into it. So Carolyn, great point about how the father of the Constitution term is deserved. One of our podcasts by Michael Klarman, he talks about Madison being the indispensable man. And then if you look at the Michael Klarman podcast, he literally ticks off 16 reasons why Madison is essential to the Constitution, right? But let's acknowledge that it's collective effort. It's a flawed collective effort, but it's also a revolutionary start. And the change in making a democracy and a republic, it's hard for us to think back of what a revolutionary step that was.
And not just Madison's writing of the Virginia Plan, which becomes the foundation for the Constitution, but also Madison's diligence at the convention. Technically there is a secretary of the Constitutional Convention that summer of 1787 who was, supposed to attend every day and take notes, but that doesn't actually happen. Luckily for us, Madison is there taking notes every single day. And this convention starts in May of that year and goes until mid-September. You're thinking all these guys in this room together, there's no deodorant at the time. There's not showers as we normally have. People are smoking and it's really hot. And yet Madison's there every day showing up, taking notes so that we know what happened in that room, because it was a private meeting. They weren't sharing what they were discussing in that room so that they could be open and, speak freely. And I think it's very important for us today to understand the process for creating a democracy. Not just that we have it and what, it says in those original 7 articles, but the conversations and debate that were happening, because we now are able to look back from this vantage point of today and say, yeah, they made these compromises and, that is really a bad idea and it led to this, or, look how they conversed to come to this agreement. We know that because of Madison's contribution.
The reason we know that Gouverneur Morris in August 8th of 1787 calls slavery the curse of heaven is because of Madison's notes, right? He really does a great job in trying to capture what happened there.
So William Lloyd Garrison, and we talked about this in 1854, for example, he said that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, right? So what would be your opinion on that? Like, considering some of the other kind of like commentary from some of the other framers. Was it a pro-slavery document, even though we talked about liberty and freedoms?
It definitely enshrined slavery in the practice. And certainly this clause is pro-slavery because of the representation. The Fugitive Slave Clause is pro-slavery.
Dred Scott decision, even.
Yes. So, I mean, George, I often start off a tour, and I can back this up saying, I believe James Madison has more positive impact on world constitutions than any person in world history. And then I repeat those superlatives. And then I say he's enslaving people his entire adult life. This guy is brilliant. He's thought about it. So can we do the both and? Can we have somebody who makes this incredible leaps in constitutions it's affecting every continent, and yet the depth of his flaws are at least as great as the things and I think the human mind, we often don't want to do that. We don't want to embrace that contradiction. But we still need to move forward.
Absolutely. All right, 6:54. One time for one more question. There will be a survey that's going to be sent out to everyone that was able to attend tonight. We specifically would love to get your feedback. I don't count this conversation between myself, Dr. Crawford-Lackey, and Mr. Campbell a one and done, right? So I do look at this as an opportunity for us to continue to, basically unpack, different topics like the Constitution and the African American experience. And so we would love for you all to take an opportunity to complete the survey that's been included in the chat. And but yeah, so 6:54. Time for one more question before we have any parting thoughts.
Can I say something about the MDC while y'all are thinking of a last question?
As long as it's good, absolutely.
The grace that members of the MDC have showed me, specifically on this property, has just been amazing, and has changed my understanding of both this property, our system of government, and it's been continual. It's been going on since I started as a part-time guide here in 2017, and it's never stopped. And it hasn't been deserved, but I have so appreciated it. And it's one of the reasons I'm still at Montpelier is the depth and the grace of the Montpelier Descendant community.
Right. Dr. Crawford-Lackey, any parting thoughts before we wrap up?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting us to have this conversation. I think we don't often enough think critically about the Constitution as, how it influenced and impacted the lived experience. Like, we know it created this framework of government, this legal structure, and here's how it, has relevance to today. But the way it shaped of this whole trajectory of people's lives is so critical. And I appreciate you, George, for facilitating this conversation in Pandora. It's just a real honor to be able to kind of connect these disparate themes and bring them together kind of in one conversation. So as you said, I hope this is the first of a longer dialogue. So it's wonderful to be with you all this evening.
Awesome. And so in the last 4 minutes, I'll give a plug and say, hey, look, we are working very hard on site as members of the Montpelier Descendants Committee, as well as the Montpelier Foundation, to tell whole truth histories and to focus on the shared experience, the shared collective experience. And so I invite you personally to come visit Montpelier, to see the great work that's taking place, whether it's the work that's taking place in terms of memorialization, the Center for the Constitution, even there is an agenda, and the agenda is to basically tell the whole truth, history of the site, and then also focusing in on the descendants of the enslaved that was there, and regardless of how these things kind of came to be, at the end of the day, it is a collective and it is a shared experience that we all have a responsibility to not only to learn about, but to embrace and also allow it to shape our worldview. And so I want to personally thank Dr. Crawford-Lackey and Mr. Patrick Campbell for sharing time with us today. I also want to thank you all as participants in this kind of first Black History event for 2025. On Saturday, the 15th, I'll be sharing my personal journey that I call Uniquely American, and I'll go into more details about that on Saturday. So feel free to sign up either through the MDC website, MontpelierDescendants.com, .org, or you can go through the Montpelier's website as some of you come in that way. Then on the 19th, we have Dr. Shelley Murphy, who is going to walk through tools for understanding genealogy, first through the African-American lens, because there are unique challenges in terms of how you uncover the past. So she's going to give us tried and true methods on how to basically make that happen. She is also senior researcher at the University of Virginia along those same lines. And she's also a consultant for the International African-American Museum in Charleston, South Carolina, where she's a staff, the paid staff to basically represent that organization in terms of helping folks navigate, those complexities associated with African-American genealogy. And last but not least, I have the honor to share the stage once again with Dr. Matt Reeves on the 27th, where we will talk about the Black landscape that is at Montpelier, and focusing on some of the archaeological finds that give additional details related to the Black labor that was there, the ingenuity even, and lesser known facts that you won't read in history books that are right there in Orange County on Montpelier's plantation in terms of understanding the ingenuity, the Black love, and the relationships and even resistance that was shared by the enslaved. So I welcome all of you to take advantage of these exciting topics. And I look forward to seeing you all soon in one of these next events. So thanks very much, and everyone have a nice night.
Thank you.